So a question often comes up about electric bikes is how do I maintain them and do they need any special maintenance? And I want to address this and I was thinking of how to do this. I'm going to just talk about maybe some of the most common questions and we're going to answer them. And we're going to kind of consider this as part one, but we're going to continually add parts to this, and the way that we're going to add those questions are from your questions specifically. So if you have questions that we don't answer in relation to this, just leave them below, and I'll do my best to answer them in the future part two. But hopefully part one is pretty comprehensive and you enjoy it, so let's get into it. So the first question is, what type of maintenance is different than a normal bike, or what type of maintenance does an electric bike require in general? For the most part, it's not all that much different than a non-electric bike. And so what that means, basically, you're going to be maintaining like the tires, the drivetrain, brakes, etc. Like these are the big things that are going to need maintenance over time. But as far as the electric bike components specifically, for the quality ones, there's generally not too much there. For us, we primarily work with Bosch, and their motors don't really require any specific maintenance. You might have software updates on occasion. I think if you did a software update like once a year, you'd probably be ahead of the game. If you do it every 6 months, it's pretty proactive, but it's just, I think Bosch is working on actually publishing more often, like when the software updates are available, and some of their new displays can actually get software updates over the air. At least the display doesn't necessarily push to the motor and the battery, but you'll see this with some of the other bikes, and I think that this is a trend that we'll start to see in the future. So at that point, then you're really just kind of dealing with the normal bike components. And many of the electric bikes that we offer also use different components that might prolong the life or prolong the service intervals that you encounter. You know, some of this might include having an internally geared hub. When you don't have the gears exposed to the elements, they're not going to really wear down as quickly, so they don't need as much maintenance. And oftentimes the maintenance is a little bit easier as far as the adjustments and that sort of thing. So the maintenance required on an electric bike, you know, to put it simply, is not all that much different than a traditional bike outside of just the little details like software updates, etc. But we'll probably plan to do some more comprehensive videos on electric bike maintenance, or at least on the maintenance of the bikes that we offer. So you might want to subscribe to our channel if you want to get updates on that sort of stuff in the future. But the software updates are generally just minor improvements in the overall experience. Maybe they might find ways that the motor can operate a little bit more efficiently, or sometimes even get a little bit more power, but it's not really required to necessarily have that software update. So it's, you know, important to note that. So the next question is, do I need a shop to maintain my electric bike, or can I do it myself? Now, as I mentioned before about these software updates, this is something that, generally speaking, is only going to be available at a Bosch dealer. So you might find that that's something you can't specifically do at home, but many of the other things you can do yourself. If you're comfortable with bike maintenance and you're familiar with that, I don't see why that's not possible. We kind of encourage for people to get familiar with their bike and to be able to do some things on their own. And we try to support that as much as possible. And we're trying to support that through these videos, and we anticipate publishing more of these videos in that sort of way. So if there's topics that you want covered on that, you know, definitely leave them in the comments below. But I'd say, you know, really there's no reason why you can't maintain the bike yourself. But there might be certain things that require a dealer specifically, and sometimes there's certain special tools that you might need that might not always make sense to own yourself. But if you do need help sourcing those, we can generally help you with that as well. Some of the more common ones might be like a lock ring tool or something like that, some stuff that might not be so common on other bicycles, but might be more specific to electric bikes. So the next question is, if I didn't buy my bike from a local dealer and I want to get maintenance on it, can I bring it to any bike shop? I think from a shop owner's perspective, I'm often concerned about liability. So I'd be looking at the bike and kind of assessing if this thing is made of quality, if it seems like they have certain safety standards and standardized parts and that sort of thing. If they don't, I generally would say stay away from it, because that's kind of scary. One, my mechanics might not be as familiar with those parts, so there might be more of a liability. Because if you're a bike shop and you're working on a bike and you hand it over to somebody and say, hey, this is good to ride, if they get hurt, even though it might not be your fault, you might have some liability. So that is a risky thing and something to be mindful of. So from our side, we try to stick to bikes with more standard parts, things that we're familiar with. And I think that's something you might find. So it's an important thing to consider when looking at some of these bikes, which might be, you know, they might look really cool, but actually when it comes down to maintaining them, it might be very complex and it might be challenging to find a shop that's going to be able to work on it. So it might be something to consider before you purchase it, to reach out to your local shop and see, you know, if they'd be comfortable. One of the reasons why I say we work with Bosch pretty much exclusively is they have a dealer network throughout the country. There's nearly 1,000 dealers that are Bosch certified, and they have a map locator, so you can actually go on there and search and say, hey, this shop is in my area, they work on Bosch, so that means that they probably have some training and they have the software necessary to provide updates, etc. And I always think it's a good measure just to reach out ahead of time to any of these shops, whether they're Bosch or otherwise, and see if they're comfortable. Also, these days, you want to make sure that they have the bandwidth to take on other clients. Right now, when we get really busy, sometimes we make the decision in our shops to only work on our own customers' bikes because it wouldn't be fair to our customers to take on work from an outside customer and push, you know, our customers to the back of the line. So important to consider, especially in these uncertain times, like how to handle those things. So the next question is, what type of tools or solvents and solutions what might you need to just do regular maintenance or care on a bike? And this is really going to vary between bikes, but for the most part, there's some kind of standard tools that you'll find really any bike mechanic will use and use pretty commonly. First is going to be Allen keys. You can really have the normal ones are starting somewhere like a 2, 2.5, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7 is usually skipped over. It's not really so common in bikes, although it is found in some bikes, not really electric bikes, but Campagnolo, for some reason, uses 7 commonly. And then 8 is another common one. So that set of Allen keys, you'll probably find it most commonly in like a multi-tool, that sort of thing. A lot of bikes from Europe tend to use Torx bits. This is something that's pretty common. So a T15, 20, 25, a 27. These are pretty common ones and definitely something you want to consider having in your toolkit if you're, you know, working on those sort of bikes. A lot of bikes that we sell use parts from Europe, and, you know, so these would be commonly used. Wrenches, one of the most common wrenches used on bikes is a 15 millimeter. That's generally for a rear axle and something you might need there and something to consider. If you want to kind of take it one step further, you might want to consider getting a torque wrench. This could be really helpful in making sure that all your parts are torqued to their specification. Now, some people will just do it by feel, but really it's recommended to use a torque wrench so you can make sure that you're, you know, doing this safely and you know that this is actually what the manufacturer recommends. Usually many of the parts will have stamped on them like 4 Newton meters or 10 Newton meters. It's just a 10 mm, and this means how much torque you want to use on that specific bolt. That's going to make sure that, one, you don't torque it too much and potentially break the bolt or put too much stress on it, which could cause premature failure, and 2, make sure that things are adequately tight. Some other wrenches that you might want to consider having, 10 millimeter is a pretty common size, 10 and 12. I think if you have a 10, 12, and a 15, you're going to be able to cover most things you might encounter on a bicycle. I mean, certainly you could opt for like a adjustable wrench or something like that, but, you know, having those specific sizes is really the way to go. Outside of that, you might also want to consider having some flat fix stuff. So, you know, maybe a patch kit, a tire lever, that sort of thing. Have additional tubes, it's a good idea. Now, there's a lot of other tools that you can add to your kit, but I don't really want to cover that today in this video. We can do that in a future video. Some other things you probably want to have is just for, you know, normal maintenance, to have some grease. Some chain lube is a really good idea. and maybe a rag or like a microfiber rag just to keep your bike clean. Keeping your bike clean is not just good for its appearance, but it also gives you an opportunity to just kind of inspect the bike on a regular basis so you can see what's going on. You might have a scenario that you have a very dirty bike, and underneath that dirt you might have a crack in your frame or something like that. Now, although this scenario might not be common, it can happen, and keeping your bike clean can really prevent one of these really dangerous situations. And probably one of the things you're going to want to do most often with your bike is check the tire pressure. You're probably going to want to pump them up pretty regularly. I mean, some people do it as much as every time they ride. I mean, if you don't want to do it that often, that's okay, but you definitely want to check it pretty regularly. So having a pump with a pressure gauge or some sort of access to air with, some ability to check the pressure is a really good idea. I personally prefer having a floor pump, especially some electric bikes have a larger tire volume, so having a floor pump that you can really get that tire pressure going up pretty quickly is definitely helpful. So next we have, how do I clean my electric bike? Now, a lot of people are kind of concerned about having an electric battery and water, and you could think that those combinations could be a bit concerning. Maybe there's some shock or something like that. For the most part, electric bikes are pretty well sealed. I mean, at least the quality ones, maybe the lower quality ones, they're not so sealed, so you definitely want to be careful about getting water near there. I mean, this kind of brings another topic about like riding in the rain, but we'll cover that in another video, which it's generally okay, especially the quality ones, I should say, that you should be able to ride it in the rain. But cleaning it, you could generally clean it just as you would a normal bike. One, it's probably a good idea to take the battery off the bike before you start cleaning it, and try to avoid getting too much water in the areas where the contacts are and that sort of thing. But you can generally take the same sort of measures you would on a traditional bike. If you want to be particularly precautious, you might want to just consider just using a rag and some sort of cleaner. There's many different cleaners that are made specifically for bikes, and I generally recommend working with something along those lines. But you can use, really whatever you like, but you want to be mindful of certain details like the paint, because some things can be harsh on the paint. If you have experience with any specific cleaners that work particularly well for you, maybe you want to leave them in the comments below so other people might be able to, try them out themselves. We've used different ones. Finish Line is something that's commonly used in different bike shops, but there's another brand, Muck Off, that makes all sorts of different cleaners, and they're pretty eco-friendly. And I think that's one thing to consider, that a lot of different cleaners, they can use harsh chemicals sometimes, so you want to be mindful of that. It's generally speaking, you can use just a cleaner and a rag. Generally, you want to brush off some of the bigger debris and kind of clean the bike up before you really get into some of the finer cleaning. When I first got into the bike business, I was pretty surprised how well you can get a bike clean without actually using any water at all, just using rags and some different cleaners and some brushes and that sort of thing. But certainly it might be the case that you want to use a hose, but there are some hazards with doing that, and it's not necessarily just getting the battery contacts wet. It's more so if you have a chain on the bike, this can be a concern. You're generally going to want to clean the chain fully before you actually start to clean the rest of the bike, because what's going to end up happening is you start spraying the bike and it sprays greasy water all over the bike, and then you end up in a scenario that your bike is dirtier than when you started, and the grease can be tough to get off there. So you definitely want to get that chain really clean with some sort of degreaser, and you're going to want to make sure to add lube to the chain afterwards. Now, we sell a lot of bikes that use a belt drive, and you don't really have to fuss with this, and you could just clean the whole bike all together, all in one, and that's one of the conveniences, but there's definitely added expenses to add a belt drive to a bike or to have a bike with that sort of system on there. So that doesn't make sense for everybody, and that application doesn't necessarily make sense for all. But some other things to definitely consider is you don't want to use a pressure washer. Using a pressure washer can be really concerning because you can end up actually pushing the grease out of some of the different areas where it needs to be, particularly in bearings and that sort of thing. So you use a pressure washer, push the grease out, then it ends up rusting, and then you end up having a lot of issues with the bike not performing as it should. So if you do use water, use low pressure water. I guess you technically could use a pressure washer and just be very careful about those areas, but that's something for, somebody that's more experienced. You definitely want to be mindful on that topic specifically. So something about cleaning an electric bike specifically you might want to be mindful is all the electric contacts. They can even get just like a surface level of corrosion that might not even necessarily be so visible to your eye, but it can actually cause some connection issues. So cleaning the contacts between the display and the display mount can be a really big one. Between the battery and the battery mount can be a really big one as well. So cleaning those, potentially even using some electric contact spray could be really helpful in these sort of scenarios, especially if you're having issues with these things. So this next one, I just want to say some miscellaneous things about electric bike care. And some of these we'll cover more in depth in other videos, but one of them is a battery. This comes up a lot. I do have another video specifically on electric bike battery care. Many people ask, how do I store a battery, or what's the best way to maintain my battery? And there's a variety of different things there. One is like, do I need to keep it fully charged? Do I need to draw it down all the way? Basically, for the modern batteries, for the most part, just charge it after you use it. You can keep it fully charged. It's not really an issue. The only scenario that you don't want to keep it fully charged is when you're storing it for an extended period. In that scenario, you probably want to drop it down to about half. That just gives the battery some ability to fluctuate up or down, and you don't really have any concern about any hazards with the battery because there's too much energy or too little energy inside of it. Another detail about storing the battery is you don't want to store it in extreme temperatures where they're extremely hot or extremely cold, so you want to be mindful of that. It's helpful if you have a bike that has a detachable battery if you're storing your bike outside, so you can take it inside in a temperature-controlled environment. Well, I hope you guys found this video to be helpful. As I said, this is just part one. We plan to produce several parts after this. If you have any additional questions, leave them in the comments below, and we'll do our best to answer them, and hope to see you in a future video. Well, see you soon.